All right, this is the information for the section in the notes entitled Revolution in the Arts. We're not going to define those three vocab terms. You're going to get information about them so you could piece together what they mean or recognize the definition about them, but we won't directly identify those three vocab terms. All right, so let's get into these different styles here. One style of art during the Revolution era, the Age of Nationalism, was uh, Romanticism. And so here's some characteristics of Romanticism that kind of reacted against the Enlightenment, which was very logical and sort of cold and rational. So they turned away from reason of the Enlightenment to emotion and focused on the emotional side of society. They turned away from issues within society like the Enlightenment focused on and focused on nature. And they didn't focus on the middle class, which is what a lot of Enlightenment thinking centered around. You had the bourgeois in France that used Enlightenment ideals to justify revolution. And so there was a lot of unintended focus on the middle class. Whereas those who embraced the style of called Romanticism focused more on other aspects of life. So, a couple of characteristics of Romanticism. Right, those who wrote romantic poetry, not meant to be all about like love and relationships, but it's a style, and they had some characteristics as well. Here's a couple of examples of poets who wrote in this style. All right, so they honored nature as a source of truth and beauty. All right, they celebrated things like rebellious heroes, passionate love, the mystery and beauty of nature, and a lot of these people lived, I guess maybe it's not inappropriate to say, emotional lives. Lived emotionally, and some of them died young. They had drama and conflict and things like that, and just coincidentally, a lot of them didn't live very long. All right, a couple of examples of authors that were famous during this time period that happened to be German. It's a new country. They're trying to establish their cultural identity. Right, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe was one author, and excuse me, and then the Grimm brothers were a second one. You probably have heard of Grimm stories. I think there's a TV show taking Grimm stories. A lot of them turned into Disney stories, and they have a nice, sweet, family-friendly sort of message. But the Grimm stories were kind of, as the name implies, dark and bloody and gruesome and things like that. And they were just a collection of stories that kids would have heard from their parents as they were growing up, being German, and they just put them together in a book, and people have liked them ever since. Another famous writer who was French, named Victor Hugo. He wrote Les Mis and The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and two famous pieces. I remember I had to read Les Mis in my 10th grade English class. That's something a lot of people are familiar with. And so he's a famous writer during this time. Another style during the time that was very popular was the Gothic horror story, and looking at the darker aspects of society. And some characteristics of these Gothic horror stories, they took place in medieval castles, which makes sense because people in the 1800s would have looked at the Middle Ages as like, it's in the Dark Ages, it's way back, it's behind the times, I can't believe they lived the way they lived. So it makes a lot of sense, and there's a lot of similarities to that today. Every year there's at least one horror movie that takes place in some sort of ancient castle, and they're filled with fearful, violent, or supernatural events. Gothic horror stories. All right, the most famous Gothic horror story out of this era was Frankenstein, and the author of that was Mary Shelley. Right, so Frankenstein. So there's a lot of different versions of this. There's a really good version with Robert De Niro and Kenneth Branagh that gives a more classical look on the tale of Frankenstein, but it's a darker aspect of society, and has monsters and things like that. So it's just a different style that hadn't been all that popular till this point. All right, the leading Romantic composer is Beethoven and his famous Ninth Symphony. Right, skip over one here. All right, and then this is an example of realist painting or realist art. You can kind of probably figure out by the name what it entails. And they focused on the way things really were, the way things are, instead of painting a picture, a view of society that wouldn't be accurate. So they focused a lot on industrialism and the effects of workers and factories. A lot of the pictures that we've looked at when we looked at industrialism came from realist artists. Photographs was kind of becoming a new thing at this time. So this was an art style that represented that, or an art, yeah, that represented that perspective. Okay. Speaking of photography, early forms of photography were invented in the 1800s. Louis Daguerre was one of the first ones to invent the photograph and the technology behind it, and the ability to capture images on glass and then paper, and in any case. And then last but not least, realists wanted to show things the way they actually were. Impressionists wanted to give you an impression of something, a perspective. As you can see from this picture here, it's not 100% clear. It's a person's impression of a scene. All right, some characteristics. So they showed a more positive view than urban life, like instead of the realists showing how dangerous and dark and abusive industrial work was, they wanted to show something more positive, like this scene here, much more positive. Right? And they also refocused on the middle class and all the things that middle class people were able to do in this new society because of the opportunities that were presented to them because of industrialization.